There is a question millions of Americans have been asking for years, and it is remarkably simple. Why does everything feel so much more expensive? Go to the grocery store and notice the total is higher than you remember. Fill up the gas tank and you wonder where the money went. You look at the prices of a house and you realize that what used to seem expensive now looks almost impossible. You renew your insurance, pay your medical bills, buy a new vehicle, order dinner, or simply try to keep up with the basic expenses of everyday life. And the same feelings keeps coming back. Something has fundamentally changed. And that brings us to one of the most misunderstood economic issues in America today: inflation. But here's the problem. When the politicians talk about inflation, when economists talk about inflation, and when ordinary Americans talk about inflation, they're often talking about three different things. The government measures inflation through statistical indexes that are designed to track changes in the prices of goods and services. The economists analyze the forces behind those changes, but Americans experience the inflation personally through their bank account. And those experiences can be very different. The latest official data available from the Bureau of Labor Statistics has shown consumer prices rising by 3.5% over the 12 months ending in June 2026. While prices excluded food and energy, it had increased 2.6%. On paper, those numbers may sound dramatically better than the inflation surge of the 2020s. But here's the part that often gets lost. The slowing inflation does not mean that prices have returned to where they were. It simply means the prices are increasing more slowly, and that distinction is absolutely critical. Imagine, for instance, a product that costs $100. If its price rises to $110, inflation has increased the price by 10%. If inflation then falls to 2%, that does not take the price back to $100. It means the price is now rising from $110 at a slower rate. And this is one reason Americans can hear that inflation is coming down while simultaneously walking into a store and thinking, then why does everything still cost so much? Both things can be true at the same time. Inflation can fall while the cost of living remains permanently elevated. And that is where the story of American inflation really begins for most people. Now, to understand what happened, we have to go back to the beginning of the pandemic. In 2020, the American economy was essential, unlike anything most people alive today had experienced. Businesses closed and factories slowed or stopped production. Transportation systems were disrupted, and workers stayed home. International trade was interrupted as well, and consumers suddenly changed what they were buying instead of spending money. Restaurants, vacations, concerts, and other services. Millions of Americans redirected their spending towards goods, and the people bought computers, televisions, furniture, vehicles, home improvement supplies, exercise equipment, appliances, and virtually anything that could make staying home more manageable. And the problem was the global economy was not prepared for the sudden transformation in demand. The supply chains became overwhelmed. Factories struggled to keep up. Shipping became more difficult, and our ports became congested. The labor shortages appeared, and suddenly there were millions of consumers trying to buy products businesses could not produce nor deliver fast enough. The Federal Reserve itself later documented how supply constraints combined with the surging demand produced shortages, bottlenecks, and soaring prices. But then another force entered the story. There were enormous government intervention during the pandemic where the federal government spent trillions of dollars supporting households, businesses, hospitals, state and local governments, and the broader economy. At the same time, the Federal Reserve dramatically lowered interest rates, and they purchased financial assets in an effort to prevent an economic collapse. There was a legitimate reason for those actions in 2020, the policymakers were really staring at the possibility of a depression-level economic disaster. Millions of jobs were disappearing, businesses were closing, and nobody knew how long the crisis would last. The objective was to keep the economy alive, and that intervention helped accomplish something important. The economy eventually recovered, but there was a consequence. Once Americans began returning to normal, economic activity demand came roaring back while supply was still struggling to recover. The Federal Reserve later described the inflation surge as a product of several forces, including the strong demand, supply chain bottlenecks, labor shortages, energy prices, and other capacity constraints, according to the Federal Reserve. And then this is where the political argument over inflation begins. One side says the government spending and monetary policy had helped create excessive demand. Another side emphasizes the pandemic supply shock and global shortages, energy markets, and geopolitical events. The reality is more complicated, however, than either political slogan. Inflation was not caused by one single person or one political party, one policy, or an event. It was the result of multiple forces colluding at the same time, and then just as the global economy was trying to recover, another enormous shock hit, and that was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The energy markets were thrown into turmoil. Food commodities became more expensive, and oil and natural gas prices surged. Transportation costs increased, and because the energy was embedded in almost everything from manufacturing to transportation to agriculture, higher energy costs can ripple through the entire economy. The Federal Reserve documented how the higher fuel costs, supply chain problems, and commodity prices and wage growth contributed to the higher food prices during that period. Think about what that means in everyday life. A farmer needs fuel. A trucking company needs diesel. A supermarket needs refrigerated transportation. A factory needs electricity. A restaurant needs food delivered. And a manufacturing needs raw materials transported. When the energy becomes more expensive, the cost can move through the entire chain before the product ever reaches the consumer. And then this brings us to the biggest misconception about inflation. The idea that every price increase was a cost by the same thing, and it isn't. Different prices can rise for completely different reasons. The gasoline can increase because of the oil markets and geopolitical instability. Your rent can increase because of housing shortages and demand, and the food can increase because of the agricultural costs and transportation labor, and rather a commodity market. Medical costs can also reflect the labor, technology, insurance structures, regulations, and demand, and so on. But cars can be affected by the semiconductor shortages as well, the manufacturing capacity, the financing costs, tariffs, and the consumer demand. There's no single inflation button sitting inside Washington that someone can simply turn off. But that does not mean that the government policy is irrelevant. Far from it. Government policy can influence demand and taxes, spending, trade, regulation, energy production, immigration, labor markets, and the broader business environment. And monetary policy matters enormously as well because the Federal Reserve controls the federal funds rate, which influences borrowing costs throughout the economy. When inflation becomes too high, the Federal Reserve can raise interest rates to make borrowing more expensive and spending less aggressive. The goal is not to punish Americans. The goal is to cool demand enough that the supply can catch up and the price pressures can ease. But there is a price to fighting inflation this way. Higher interest rates can make mortgages more expensive. They can make car loans more expensive. They can make credit card debt more painful. And they can discourage businesses, investment. They can slow the hiring. In other words, the medicine used to fight inflation can also create its own economic pain. And that is a central balancing act facing the Federal Reserve, bringing inflation down without causing causing an unnecessary severe recession. And then there is housing. For many Americans, housing is where inflation becomes painfully real. The CPI showed shelter prices still rising 3.3% over the 12 months ending in June of 2026, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The housing is particularly important because it represents such a large share of the household budget, and if rent rises, that isn't a minor inconvenience. It can fundamentally change someone's ability to save money, pay down debt, start a family, or buy a home. And this creates another paradox. Even if the inflation slows dramatically, housing can remain expensive because of the underlying level of pricing that has already changed. The same thing applies to groceries as well. If a family grocery bill was dramatically higher after several years of inflation, a slowdown in grocery inflation does not automatically restore the old prices. The family is still paying the new price level. This is why the phrase "inflation is down" can sound almost insulting to someone standing at a checkout counter. They aren't thinking about the rate of change, they're thinking about the total bill. And then there is another issue that Americans increasingly have to consider: tariffs. The trade policy can affect the inflation because of tariffs raises the cost of the imported goods and the imported inputs used by American businesses. And according to the Congressional Budget Office, the tariff increase implemented in 2025 was expected to temporarily raise inflation in 2026, with the effects spreading through imported consumer goods, intermediate inputs, and even domestically produced products competing with imports. That does not mean tariffs are automatically good or bad. There is a larger policy debate over whether tariffs can encourage domestic production, protect strategic industries, and reduce the dependence on foreign supply chains, or actually strengthen America's negotiating position. But economically, there is a straightforward question: who ultimately pays the cost? The businesses can absorb some of it through lower profit margins. Foreign exporters can absorb some of it, but a substantial portion can eventually be passed through to American consumers in the form of higher prices. The CBO estimated that most of the tariff-related costs borne domestically would ultimately show up in higher consumer prices. And that brings us to another question that is much bigger than inflation itself. What does it actually mean to live in an economy where prices have risen faster than many people's sense of financial security? Because inflation is not evenly distributed, someone earning a high income may be able to absorb a 10% increase in groceries, gasoline, insurance, or rent without changing their lifestyle very much. But a family living paycheck to paycheck may have no such flexibility. The same percentage increase can produce radically different consequences depending on the income and savings. Federal Reserve research has specifically noted that high food and energy prices can be particularly painful for lower income households because of necessities that consume a larger share of their budget. And this is why inflation can become political so quickly. It isn't just an economic statistic, it affects people's perception of whether their government is working. It affects whether workers feel their raises actually mean anything, and it affects whether young adults believe they can afford a house. It affects whether parents believe they can provide the same opportunities they had growing up. It affects retirement plans, and it affects consumer confidence, and eventually it affects elections. But there is another side of the story that deserves attention: wages. If wages rise faster than prices, workers can actually gain purchasing power even during inflation. If the prices rise faster than wages, the workers effectively become poorer even if their paycheck gets larger in dollar terms. This is why looking at a nominal wages alone can be misleading. A worker making more money today than 5 years ago is not necessarily better off if rent, food, transportation, healthcare, insurance, and other necessities have risen even faster. The question isn't simply, are wages higher? The question is, what can those wages actually buy? That is the heart of purchasing power. And purchasing power is ultimately what inflation is about. Now here's where the conversation gets even more complicated. Some Americans blame corporations, some blame the government spending, some blame the Federal Reserve. Some blame energy policy and some blame supply chains. Some blame tariffs and some blame labor shortages. Some blame corporate profit margins and some blame globalization. And depending on the particular period and industry, different explanations can contain some truth. But the biggest mistake is looking for a single villain. Economies are systems. When demand changes, supply responds. When energy prices change, transportation costs change. When wages change, businesses' costs can change. And when interest rates change, borrowing changes. When the tariffs change, import prices change. When housing supply is restricted, rents and home prices can respond. And when consumers expect prices to continue rising, those expectations can influence wage negotiations, purchasing decisions, and business pricing. Inflation is therefore not simply a story about greedy corporations or reckless politicians. It is a story about millions of decisions interacting inside a massive economic system. And yet, there is an uncomfortable truth that should be impossible to ignore. Once inflation changes, the price level getting the inflation rate back down does not reverse all the damage. And that is why the Americans can be told that inflation is improving while still feeling financially squeezed. The inflation rate measures how quickly the prices are changing. It does not erase the price increases that already happened. Think of it like climbing a staircase. Inflation is the speed at which you are climbing. If you slow down, you are still standing on the higher step. And that may be the single most important thing for Americans to understand about the current economy. The fight isn't simply about getting inflation from 3% to 2%. The larger question is whether American households can eventually see their incomes, savings, housing affordability, and standard of living catch up with the higher prices, the higher price levels left behind by the inflation shock. That is a much harder problem, and it raises an even bigger question. What happens if Americans gets inflation under control, but never solves the structural problems that made everyday life so expensive in the first place? What happens if housing remains unaffordable? What happens if healthcare costs continue rising? What happens if insurance premiums continue climbing? And what happens if energy becomes more volatile? What happens if government debt continues expanding and interest payments consume an increasing portion of the federal budget? What happens if trade policy produces higher prices but also creates stronger domestic production? What happens if automation and artificial intelligence dramatically increases productivity but distributes the benefit unevenly? All of these questions don't have simple partisan answers, and that is exactly why they deserve serious discussion, because the real story behind America's cost of living crisis is not simply that Americans are paying more. It is that the economic environment underneath everyday life has changed. The pandemic exposed the weaknesses in global supply chains. Massive intervention prevented a catastrophic collapse, but contributed to an extraordinary demand recovery. Supply constraints collide with that demand, and energy and commodity shocks intensified the problem. The Federal Reserve eventually responded with aggressive monetary tightening. Inflation came down from its extreme highs, but the price level remained elevated, and now new pressures, including trade policy and geopolitical instability, could influence the next chapter. The challenge for America is no longer simply stopping preventing an inflation explosion. It is rebuilding an economy where ordinary people can once again feel that working hard and earning a paycheck, saving money and planning for the future actually provides a realistic path forward. Because at the end of the day, Americans don't live inside CPI tables. They live inside houses, apartments, grocery stores, gas stations, hospitals, workplaces, and bank accounts. They don't experience inflation as a percentage. They experience it when the money in their wallet buys less than it used to. And perhaps that is the most important question we should be asking. If inflation is supposedly coming under control, when will Americans actually feel the difference? Because the real measure of America's economy, or economic health for that matter, isn't just whether a government statistic improves. It is rather the average American can look at their paycheck, look at their expenses, and look at the future, and honestly say, I can afford to live here. And until more Americans can say that with confidence, the inflation story is not really over. I want to thank you for tuning in to the Unfiltered Political Lens. This has been another great monologue. I appreciate you being here. I hope you enjoyed. And as always, we'll see you in the next episode. Peace.